So this week's big idea is that I want to use fantasy football to contextualize the way we're thinking about certain players this year. And why do I want to do this? Because right now, fantasy football is the preeminent way that most people bet on football in this country. It is the most popular fantasy sport. It has largely allowed football to dominate an entire day of the week, to dominate the cultural conversation for months at a time. And it is also sort of the indoctrination machine I think that football is banking on. It is conditioning people to gamble on the games in a way that I don't know if it's healthy or not, but I think that at the very least, fantasy football has such a wide cultural footprint that we can look at how players going into the year are being ranked and use that information to identify possible values for the season in terms of season-long totals, potential players to bet on or bet against. A lot of times, regular, non-obsessive football fans are not following the week-to-week details of some of these players. They may have checked out of week by week 7 of the following year. Let's say they had a bad fantasy season. They're not necessarily tracking what Jamar Chase is doing in week 14 or week 18. But that just means that when they come back to these fantasy preseason drafts in, let's say, August of whatever the year is, the following year, this is the first time they're looking at some of these guys in quite some time. These preseason rankings, whether they intend to or not, shape a lot of the way that we think about a player. So what I want to do here is I want to go through some of the first-round guys, some of the projected first-round picks that I looked around at various different websites, Fantasy Pros, ESPN, Yahoo, guys who were being projected as high draft picks. And I wanted to identify players who we could possibly bet against. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because one of the notions that really prevails in fantasy football and fantasy football prognosticating is this idea of falling for the new hotness. A lot of times in fantasy football, there is a new hot player who comes onto the scene, end of season or mid-season, and they are just on fire. They're unstoppable. They're scoring all the time. They have all these big games. And a lot of times this happens with running backs or young running backs, let's say a rookie or a second-year player who people have been waiting to break out. And when that does happen, fantasy football prognosticators and fantasy football drafters have a tendency to overvalue that player going into the next season because they have difficulty separating what was accomplished the following season from what may have been advantageous factors that allow that opportunity to present itself the following season. Thinking about guys like Melvin Gordon, his rookie year, Jeremy Hill, Kenyon Drake 2 years ago. Kenyon Drake traded to the Cardinals midseason, bursts onto the scene, has a few huge games, right? And people remember them because they were prime time games. But going into the next year, he's now projected as a first-round pick. And you know what? He didn't deliver. He was not a guy who you wanted to be your first-round pick. But because people kind of bought into this notion that he had finally found a system that was really going to optimize his talent, he ends up going in the first round. And he is just another cautionary tale of this new hotness coming in, people buying into these narratives and carrying that over into the following season. In looking to this coming season, I wanted to identify a few guys who I would call new hotness players. And in doing so, who I think there may be some value to be had betting against in terms of season totals. First up, Jamar Chase. Oh, I know. It's sacrilege, right? This is a guy who is one of the funnest players to watch, by bar none, one of the funnest players to watch of the last several years to come into this league. He is a guy who is electric. He gets the ball in his hands. He runs 70 yards. He blows past every defender. Week in and week out, he had some of the biggest fantasy football games of all time last year as a rookie. So how can I possibly be saying to bet against him, right? And here's why. A lot of his plays were these big, massive, yards after the catch, explosive plays. And it's not like those aren't necessarily repeatable. We've seen Tyreek Hill do that on a year-to-year basis almost. But Tyreek Hill, if you really paid attention to his career, came into the league and sort of initially was this guy who was a big home run hitting stud, who did a lot of the same stuff Jamar Chase is doing in terms of making these big explosive plays. But as Tyreek Hill progressed as a talent, he started to have those parts of the field taken away from him. And over the last 2 to 3 years, we really saw him progress as a route runner, progress as a guy in the red zone who could get open in a myriad of different ways. He's not the guy who came into the league as this burner, this freakish talent, right? And Jamar Chase, I think, is an incredibly gifted route runner himself, and we saw that a lot last year. But what I'm betting against here, and what I think I will end up taking a lot of his unders on totals, touchdowns, yardage, all that stuff. And the reason for that is that I don't see him getting a lot more volume. And I think last year he saw 128 targets. If you're really going to be a wide receiver one, a top flight, top 5 guy in this league, you really need to be seeing at minimum 150 targets. And it's not like there's not an opportunity for him to see more targets this year. Well, I recognize that. I recognize that the Bengals spent a lot of the offseason rebuilding their offensive line, in part in preparation for providing him with that opportunity to get more targets. But the problem for me with Ja'Marr Chase this year is that this is a guy who really benefited from explosive plays. And if defenses begin taking that away from him, can he adjust and still get that value? Is he still going to see the sort of touchdown numbers and the sort of big yardage numbers if he's not getting those explosive 75-yard touchdowns every week? I think the answer is no. What really concerns me about a lot of Ja'Marr Chase's totals, or why I would be betting on the under for them, is not even necessarily about Ja'Marr Chase as a talent. It's about the fact that he's surrounded by 2 receivers in Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins, who are unto themselves very capable receivers who saw a lot of volume last year. We're looking at T. Higgins, 2 years in the league, 110 targets and 108 targets. This is a guy who I don't see those numbers going down. That seems like a baseline for me because he really has come to his own into his own as a receiver as well. And Tyler Boyd is a few years removed from being a 1,000-yard receiver. This is a number 3 who's better than a lot of teams' number 2s and a lot of teams' number 1s, for that matter. Tyler Boyd is a very talented receiver who last year saw 96 targets. I understand that there's something of a target vacuum that's been created in the wake of C.J. Uzomah leaving, but nonetheless, I have to say, I don't see how Ja'Marr Chase is going to hit a lot of what I can only believe are going to be astronomical total numbers. I think they're going to project Ja'Marr Chase for 14 and a half touchdowns, something like 1,300 yards. And I'm taking the under on that all day because I think this is a guy who he is very much going to be, in my opinion, a top 10 receiver. But I don't necessarily buy into him being that top 3 guy that he's going to be drafted in fantasy leagues as, and where a lot of his player totals are going to be lined up as at the start of the season. Moving on, let's talk about Austin Ekeler. I'm betting against Ekeler any opportunity I can. This is a guy who is not a 3-down back. He doesn't see the volume there. I understand that now in fantasy, especially, you see a lot of these guys who aren't necessarily getting volume, but they're getting high leverage opportunities and high value opportunities. So, for example, Austin Ekeler last year, 18 red zone carries, 18 red zone touchdowns. This is a guy who he knew when to get the ball. He knew when to have that opportunity, and he made the most of it. Let's just say that. He was a guy who got in the end zone when the opportunity presented itself. But I don't see him repeating those numbers. It's such a tall order to ask of somebody to convert those opportunities at such a high rate year in and year out. So Austin Ekeler is another guy who I'm betting under on a lot of his rushing totals. He's also has durability issues that I don't think this year is going to solve. I think he's another year older. I think that I don't necessarily trust him to stay on the field every week. He had injury issues basically every year he's been in the league. So I'm betting against him on a lot of his unders, and I look at him as a first top 3 or 4 pick in fantasy, and I go, what? Why? You're a crazy person if you take him up there. Now, James Conner. James Conner, oh my God, I'm so eager to bet the unders on this guy because I really love James Conner as a person. Former Pitt player, former Steeler, and he's a guy who's extremely talented, works extremely hard, but he's playing in an offense that I loathe entirely. I think that this Cardinals offense is not going to be the explosive offense that we've seen of the last couple of years. And this is another guy who's due for some negative touchdown regression. He was a touchdown machine last year. I think he had 19 on the ground, and he was extremely effective within the red zone. But we've seen him have durability concerns of his own, number one. Number two, I think that this is a team, and the Cardinals is going to be playing a first-place schedule, and we could very much see this team have the wheels start falling off. Between the Kyler Murray drama, Kingsbury being sort of a lame duck. I know he got an extension, but I think there's some heat on him to really make this team a contender this year. And now, finally, the last guy I want to talk about in terms of betting against this year based on his fantasy value and seeing him overvalued early preseason is DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift is another low-volume, non-3 down back who is going to be projected for big yardage numbers, big totals. He's another guy who's dealt with durability concerns. He's another guy who has all the talent in the world but can't seem to stay on the field. So any opportunity I have to bet against these low-volume, injury-prone backs and players, I'm going to take it because I think there's value to be had on betting the unders on these season totals. I think there's so much emphasis put on betting the overs that a lot of times we get caught up in the idea that most of the time these unders are going to win. And the reason for that is that people get hurt in football. There is a lot of injury baked into these totals. I hope that these stats have been helpful in sort of identifying some trends that may allow you to make some money on season-long totals. When these totals come out, we'll dig a little bit deeper. But I wanted to just talk about 4 guys who I really think are being overvalued preseason. So remember, don't fall for the new hotness. In fact, go the opposite way. Try to make money on people buying into these narratives and take it all to the bank.